Sometimes the most beautiful prisons are built with diamond-encrusted bars and lined with silk. Althea Gibson stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Manhattan penthouse, watching the city's heartbeat pulse in waves of golden light. 30 floors below, her reflection stared back, a woman whose beauty had been polished to perfection, yet whose eyes held the hollow emptiness of a caged songbird. At 8 months pregnant, her body carried new life, while her soul felt more lifeless than ever. The marble floors beneath her bare feet felt frigid, just like everything else in this pristine mausoleum Ben called home. Even the baby's movements inside her seemed muted here, as if the child already sensed the suffocating atmosphere of conditional love and calculated affection that permeated every corner of their lives. "You're standing again," Ben Shelton's voice cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. At 35, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made boardrooms fall silent and subordinates scramble, but tonight his tone carried the particular chill reserved exclusively for his wife. "Dr. Hayes said you should be resting." Althea didn't turn around. She'd learned to read his moods in the reflection of windows, in the cadence of his footsteps, in the way the very air seemed to tighten when his patience wore thin. "I was watching the sunset," she said softly, her hand instinctively moving to cradle the swell of her belly. "The sunset." Ben's laugh held no warmth. "Always the artist, aren't you? Still seeing poetry in everything." He moved closer, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, perfume that wasn't hers, again. "Speaking of which, I noticed you've been painting again. That little hobby of yours." The dismissive way he said hobby made her heart clench. Her art had once been her voice, her passion, her purpose. Now it felt like a secret rebellion she practiced in stolen moments when Ben traveled or worked late. "I enjoy it," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. Ben's reflection appeared beside hers in the window, his hand possessively settling on her shoulder. "Well, now that you're carrying my air, perhaps it's time to focus on more important things. The nursery still needs final touches, and Mother wants to review the nanny candidates next week." My heir. Not our child or our baby, but my heir. As if the life growing inside her was already another acquisition in his vast portfolio of possessions. Althea closed her eyes and felt the baby shift, tiny limbs pressing against her ribs as if seeking escape from a world they hadn't even entered yet. "Of course," she murmured, because arguing required energy she no longer possessed, and because the cost of defiance had been made clear in countless small cruelties over the past 3 years of marriage. Ben's grip on her shoulder tightened briefly, not enough to bruise, never enough to leave visible marks, but enough to remind her of the power dynamic that ruled their relationship. "Good girl. Now I have some calls to make. Try to eat something. You look pale." As his footsteps retreated toward his study, Althea finally turned from the window. The penthouse stretched before her like a museum exhibit, everything perfect, everything expensive, everything cold. Modern art that cost more than most people's houses adorned the walls, but none of it spoke to her soul the way a simple sketch of children playing in Harlem once had. She made her way to the small alcove that Ben grudgingly allowed her to use as a studio, though studio was generous for the space that barely accommodated an easel and a modest collection of art supplies. Her latest painting sat half-finished, a storm scene with dark clouds swirling over turbulent waters. She'd been working on it for weeks, adding layers of grey and black that seemed to reflect the tempest brewing in her own heart. As she picked up a brush, footsteps in the hallway made her freeze. But these weren't Ben's confident strides. These were quieter, more careful. A gentle knock on the doorframe made her look up. "Mrs. Shelton?" Tommy Paul stood in the doorway, and for the first time in months, Althea felt the presence of genuine warmth in her sterile world. At 32, he possessed the kind of quiet strength that made people feel safe without feeling intimidated, a rare quality in Ben's circle of aggressive, ambitious men. His brown hair was perpetually neat, his clothes simple but well-fitted, and his hazel eyes held a warmth that seemed almost revolutionary in this frigid penthouse. "I brought you some chamomile tea. My grandmother always said it was good for expectant mothers." Althea blinked in surprise. In the 6 months since, Ben had hired Tommy as her personal bodyguard. She'd barely exchanged more than polite pleasantries with the man. He was simply part of the background of her life, opening doors, checking security, maintaining the protective bubble Ben insisted she live within. But now, he stood before her holding a delicate china cup that steamed with the gentle fragrance of chamomile and honey. "That's very thoughtful," she said, accepting the cup with hands that trembled slightly. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and she felt a spark of human warmth that seemed almost shocking after the emotional Arctic she'd been living in. "Thank you, Tommy." "You're welcome, Ma'am." His eyes briefly took in her painting, and she saw something flicker in their depths. Not the polite disinterest most people showed her work, but genuine appreciation. "That's beautiful. The way you've captured the movement in the clouds. It's like watching the storm build." Heat flooded her cheeks. When was the last time someone had really looked at her art, really seen what she was trying to express? "It's just something I've been working on," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not just anything." Tommy's voice was soft but firm. "Art like that comes from somewhere deep. It means something." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, united by an understanding that transcended their supposed roles as employer and employee. Althea sipped her tea and felt warmth spread through her chest, not just from the beverage, but from the simple act of being truly seen by another human being. The sound of Ben's study door opening shattered the moment like glass. Tommy immediately stepped back, his expression returning to professional neutrality, but not before Althea caught a glimpse of something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. Understanding, compassion, and something else that made her feel more awake than she had in months. "I should let you rest," Tommy said quietly, but his gaze lingered on her face for just a heartbeat longer than propriety demanded. As he disappeared into the hallway, Althea stood alone with her painting and her tea, feeling for the first time in her marriage that she wasn't completely invisible. The baby moved again, more gently this time, and she found herself wondering if the child could sense the shift in her emotional atmosphere. Outside the windows, night was falling over Manhattan, painting the city in shades of amber and shadow, but for the first time in months, Althea didn't feel like she was drowning in darkness. Somewhere in this cold penthouse, there was a man who saw storms in her paintings and thought to bring her grandmother's remedy for troubled hearts. The question that would keep her awake that night was simple but dangerous. What did it mean when the hired help showed more care for her well-being than the man who had promised to love her until death did them part? Chapter 2. Invisible Guardian. The most profound acts of love are often performed by those who expect nothing in return. Morning light filtered through silk curtains as Althea woke to the familiar symphony of Ben's morning routine. Shower running, phone calls already beginning, the mechanical precision of a man who treated each day like a hostile takeover waiting to happen. She pressed her palm against her belly, feeling the baby's gentle stirring as they too awakened to another day in their gilded cage. The nausea hit without warning, just as it had during her first trimester. Lately, it returned in unpredictable waves that left her dizzy and shaken. She barely made it to the bathroom before her stomach rebelled, leaving her clinging to cold marble while her body betrayed her with violent heaves. Althea. Ben's voice carried irritation even through the bathroom door. "We have the Hartwell brunch in an hour. Please tell me you're not having another episode." Another episode. As if her body's struggle to nurture their child was merely an inconvenience to his social calendar. She rinsed her mouth and caught sight of herself in the mirror, pale, exhausted, her usually glowing complexion dulled by stress and sleepless nights. "I'm fine," she called back, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Good. Wear the navy dress, the one that makes you look—" Ben paused, and she could practically hear him calculating the most diplomatic way to say what he really meant. "The one that's most flattering for your condition." 20 minutes later, Althea sat in the back of their Mercedes, trying to keep her composure as Ben reviewed talking points for the business brunch. The navy maternity dress felt like a costume, designed to make her pregnancy appear elegant and contained, rather than the messy, wonderful miracle it actually was. "Remember," Ben was saying, "Harrison Hartwell is considering our bid for the downtown development project. His wife, Margaret, has some very traditional views about family, so let's emphasize the stability of our household. And please try to eat something this time. Your appetite has been concerning lately." Concerning to whom? Althea wondered. Certainly not to the man sitting beside her, whose concern seemed focused entirely on how her pregnancy reflected on his image rather than her actual well-being. The nausea struck again as they pulled up to the Hartwell estate in the Hamptons. This time she couldn't hide it. Her hand flew to her mouth as her stomach lurched violently, and she fumbled for the door handle with panic-stricken desperation. Before Ben could even react, Tommy was there. He appeared at her side of the car so quickly it seemed like magic, opening her door and offering his arm for support as she stumbled out onto the gravel driveway. In his other hand, he held a small glass of what looked like ginger ale with a mint sprig. "Sip this slowly," he said quietly, his voice steady and reassuring. "The ginger will help settle your stomach, and the mint makes it easier to keep down." Althea accepted the glass with trembling hands, too grateful to question how. He'd known exactly what she needed or where he'd gotten it. The fizzy liquid worked like a miracle, soothing her rebellious stomach and clearing the fog from her head. "Better?" Tommy asked, and she nodded, surprised to find that she actually was better. "How did you—" she began, but Ben's sharp voice cut through her question. "Are you quite finished?" Ben had emerged from the car, his expression tight with barely controlled annoyance. "The Hartwells are waiting." But as they walked toward the elegant estate, Althea found herself stealing glances at Tommy, who maintained his professional distance, while somehow managing to convey with his presence alone that she was safe, that someone was watching out for her needs, even when her own husband seemed oblivious to them. The brunch was everything she'd come to expect from Ben's business gatherings. Exquisite. Food, polite conversation, and the constant undercurrent of deals being made and alliances being forged. Margaret Hartwell was indeed traditional, spending most of the meal discussing the importance of strong family values, while her own children were conspicuously absent, raised by nannies and boarding schools. "Althea is such a treasure," Margaret was saying, patting Althea's hand with condescending affection, "so quiet and well-behaved. You've chosen well, Ben. A wife should compliment her husband's success, not compete with it." Althea smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, playing her role as the perfect accessory to Ben's ambition. But when she excused herself to use the restroom, her designer heels proved treacherous on the marble floors. Her balance, already affected by pregnancy, deserted her completely, and she felt herself falling toward the unforgiving stone. Strong arms caught her before impact, steadying. her with gentle firmness. Tommy had appeared again, as if he possessed some sixth sense for when she needed help. "Easy," he murmured, his hands supporting her until she found her footing. "These floors are slippery. Would you like me to find you different shoes?" "I'm fine," she started to say, but then noticed that her feet had swollen during the long brunch, making her expensive heels feel like instruments of torture. "Actually, yes, if you don't mind." Within minutes, Tommy had somehow produced a pair of elegant flats in her exact size. As she slipped them on, she looked up at him with curiosity. "How did you know my shoe size?" A slight flush colored his cheeks. "I notice things. It's my job to anticipate what you might need." But Althea sensed there was more to it than professional duty. The way he looked at her, the attentive focus on her comfort, the small kindnesses that went far beyond what Ben required of him. These weren't the actions of a man simply doing his job. On the drive home, Ben was jubilant about securing the Hartwell deal, but Althea found herself thinking about Tommy's quiet competence, his intuitive understanding of her needs. When was the last time Ben had noticed that her shoes were uncomfortable? When had he last brought her something to settle her stomach without being asked? That evening she discovered Tommy in the kitchen, carefully preparing a plate of plain crackers and mild cheese, exactly what her pregnancy-addled digestive system could handle. "You don't have to take care of me," she said softly, though her heart warmed at the gesture. Tommy looked up from his careful arrangement of the simple meal. "Everyone deserves to be taken care of, Mrs. Shelton, especially when they're carrying new life." "Please," she said, settling onto a stool at the kitchen island. "Call me Althea, and tell me about yourself. I realize I know almost nothing about the man who seems to know everything about me." For a moment uncertainty flickered across his features, then he seemed to make a decision. "I have a younger sister," he said quietly, continuing to arrange the crackers with meticulous care. "Willow, she's been sick for a long time, leukemia. This job, it helps me take care of her medical bills." The simple confession hit Althea like a physical blow. Here was a man working for her dismissive husband, enduring Ben's casual contempt, all to save his sister's life. The nobility of it, the quiet sacrifice made her throat tight with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "That must be terrifying." "It is." Tommy's hands stilled on the plate. "But she's strong, stronger than me most days. She's 18 now, wants to be an art teacher when she gets better." He glanced up at Althea. "She'd love your paintings." "You've told her about my art." "I may have mentioned that the lady I work for creates beautiful things." Tommy's smile was soft, genuine. "Willow believes art can heal the world, one painting at a time." Althea felt tears prick her eyes. When had Ben last spoken about her art with such reverence? When had he ever described her as someone who created beautiful things? "I'd like to meet her someday," she said impulsively. "She'd love that." Tommy's expression grew warm, then carefully neutral as footsteps approached. Ben appeared in the kitchen doorway, his gaze taking in the intimate scene with sharp attention. "What's this?" "Tommy was kind enough to prepare something for my stomach," Althea said quickly. "How thoughtful." Ben's tone suggested it was anything but. "Though I think my wife is perfectly capable of feeding herself. Perhaps you could focus on security matters instead of kitchen duties." The dismissal was clear, and Tommy accepted it with characteristic grace. But as he passed Althea on his way out, he paused just long enough to whisper, "The crackers will help. Trust me." Later that night, as Ben worked in his study and the penthouse settled into its usual cold quiet, Althea stood again at her favorite window. But this time, instead of feeling trapped, she found herself thinking about a young woman named Willow who believed art could heal the world, and about the man who sacrificed everything to keep his sister's dreams alive. The baby kicked, gently as if responding to her shift in mood, and Althea pressed her hand to the spot with a smile. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, love still existed in the world, even if she had to look beyond her marriage to find it. Chapter 3. Breaking Hearts. The cruelest wounds are often inflicted by those who claim to love us most. The morning arrived with all the warmth of a blade sliding between ribs. Althea woke to Ben's phone, buzzing with military precision against the nightstand, and to the sound of his voice already sharp with business efficiency, despite the early hour. She lay still, watching him pace their bedroom in his silk pajamas, his free hand gesturing emphatically as he discussed quarterly projections with someone on the West Coast. "No, Henderson, you're missing the point entirely," Ben snapped. "Into the phone. The merger needs to close before the end of the month, or we lose the tax advantages. Do I need to fly out there and hold your hand through this?" Althea shifted carefully, trying to ease the pressure in her lower back without drawing attention to herself. At 8 months pregnant, sleep had become elusive, and mornings felt like emerging from a battle she was slowly losing. The baby seemed to sense her tension, moving restlessly as if sharing her discomfort. "Mother is flying in today," Ben announced without preamble as he ended his call. "She wants to inspect the nursery before the baby arrives. Apparently, she has concerns about our choices." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air settled over Althea. Juniper Shelton was a woman who could freeze blood with a glance, and who viewed Althea's pregnancy as both a necessary evil and a personal inconvenience. Their previous encounters had left Althea feeling as though she'd been dissected under a microscope and found wanting in every possible way. "Of course," Althea replied carefully. "What time should I expect her?" "Noon," and Althea. Ben's tone carried the particular edge that always preceded criticism. "Please make an effort to look appropriate. Mother has very specific ideas about how a Shelton wife should present herself." The words hit their mark with surgical precision. Althea had spent 3 years learning to decode Ben's language, understanding that appropriate meant smaller, quieter, less visible. It meant straightening her naturally curly hair until it lay in submission against her scalp, wearing colors that wouldn't draw attention, speaking only when directly addressed. After Ben left for his office, Althea spent an hour preparing for battle. She chose a conservative beige dress that made her feel like wallpaper, but would meet Juniper's approval, twisted her hair into a severe bun that pulled at her temples, and applied makeup with the precision of war paint. The woman in the mirror looked polished and proper and absolutely nothing like the vibrant artist who had once painted murals in Harlem community centers. The memories of those days rushed back unbidden, the smell of acrylic paint in the morning air, the way children's faces lit up when they saw their neighborhood transformed by color and imagination. She remembered painting a garden scene on the wall of the community center, how 5-year-old Marcus had tugged on her paint-stained jeans and asked if she could paint his family into the flowers. She'd spent an extra hour that day, carefully adding small figures among the blooms, a mother, a father, 3 children, and even the family dog, all living forever in a painted paradise where love grew like wildflowers. Now she lived in a penthouse, worth more than that entire neighborhood, surrounded by art that cost fortunes but spoke to no one's soul, carrying a child who would never know the simple joy of watching beauty bloom from nothing but imagination and love. Juniper Shelton arrived, precisely at noon, sweeping into the penthouse like a well-dressed hurricane. At 62, she maintained the kind of razor-sharp elegance that made younger women feel inadequate and grown men question their net worth. Her silver hair was pulled back in a chignon that could have been carved from marble, and her steel grey. Suit probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Althea, dear. Juniper's kiss was air, her embrace purely performative. You look substantial. I suppose that's to be expected in your condition. The word substantial landed like a slap, but Althea kept her expression pleasant. Thank you for coming, Juniper. I know Ben appreciates your input. Yes, well, someone needs to ensure this child is raised properly. Juniper's gaze swept over the penthouse with the critical eye of a general surveying a battlefield. Speaking of which, I'd like to see what you've done with the nursery. Althea led her down the hallway, pride warring with anxiety in her chest. She'd spent weeks transforming the spare bedroom into a warm, welcoming space for their child. Soft yellow walls complemented by hand-painted murals of friendly forest animals. A rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light, and carefully chosen books and toys that would stimulate a growing mind. The centerpiece was a mural she'd created across one entire wall. A magical forest where rabbits wore tiny scarves, deer had flowers in their antlers, and birds carried love letters between the trees. She'd crafted it in the style of the old storybooks her grandmother had read to her, full of whimsy and wonder, and the kind of magic that made children believe anything was possible. Juniper's reaction was immediate and devastating. Oh, my dear. Her voice dripped with the kind of pity usually reserved for the terminally ill. This simply won't do at all. I thought it was cheerful, Althea said weakly, watching her months of careful work being dismissed with a glance. Cheerful? Juniper moved through the room with the measured steps of someone accustomed to reshaping environments to her will. Althea, this child will be a Shelton. Sheltons are raised with an appreciation for refinement, for understated elegance. We don't encourage excessive imagination in our children. Structure and discipline create successful adults. Each word cut deep, dismissing months of loving work with surgical precision. Althea had created those murals with her own hands, pouring love and hope into every brushstroke. She'd imagined their child falling asleep to friendly rabbit faces and waking up to smiling deer, surrounded by the kind of whimsical joy that had been slowly leached from her own life. Look at this ridiculous rabbit, Juniper continued, pointing at Althea's favorite figure, a small bunny wearing a red scarf who seemed to wink at anyone who looked closely enough. What kind of values does this teach a child? That animals are playmates rather than resources? That the world is some kind of fairy tale where everything is soft and safe? Althea's throat tightened. The rabbit with the red scarf was painted in memory of her grandmother's stories, tales of brave little creatures who helped lost children find their way home. She'd imagined reading those same stories to her baby, pointing to the painted characters and watching her child's imagination bloom. The walls will need to be repainted, Juniper continued, pulling out her phone to make notes. White or cream. Something clean and sophisticated. And these decorations will have to go. I'll have my decorator recommend appropriate artwork. Nothing too stimulating, mind you. Children need calm environments to develop proper temperaments. But what about imagination? Althea found herself asking, the question escaping before she could stop herself. Don't children need beauty and color and stories that help them dream? Juniper's laugh was sharp as winter wind. Dreams are luxuries for people who can afford them, dear. Shelton children learn responsibility first, imagination second, if at all. She turned to study Althea with the same critical eye she'd applied to the nursery. I see where these ideas come from, of course. Your background. But Benjamin's child needs to understand their heritage, their responsibilities. They need to learn that the world is serious business, not some painted playground. The casual dismissal of everything Althea valued Her art, her heritage, her vision for their child's future hit harder than any of Ben's calculated cruelties. At least when Ben hurt her, it was personal. Juniper's disdain was broader, encompassing. Not just Althea, but everything she represented, everything she'd ever been or hoped to become. Tommy appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by some invisible signal of distress. His eyes took in the scene quickly, Juniper cataloguing everything that needed to be corrected, and Althea standing in the ruins of her dreams with tears threatening to spill. "Mrs. Shelton." His voice was carefully neutral. "I hate to interrupt, but Dr. Hayes called. She'd like to move up your appointment to this afternoon, if possible." It was a lie, a beautiful, merciful lie that offered Althea an escape route. She grabbed it gratefully. "Of course. I should go prepare." As she fled the nursery, she heard Juniper's voice trailing behind her. "Tommy, isn't it? Please have these walls painted by tomorrow. I'll email you the color specifications. And do see about having this artwork removed professionally. Some of it might be salvageable for a community center or something." The suggestion that her carefully crafted murals might be salvageable for charity was the final insult. Althea made it to her art studio before the tears came. She collapsed into the chair beside her easel, pressing her hands against her belly as sobs shook her body. Everything she'd created for her child, every loving detail, every hopeful brushstroke, dismissed as inadequate, inappropriate, wrong. "Mrs. Shelton." Tommy's voice was soft from the doorway. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him through tear-blurred vision, this man who had lied to rescue her from further humiliation. "She hates everything I did for the baby, every single thing." Tommy stepped into the room, closing the door gently behind him. "She's wrong." "Is she?" Althea wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Maybe I don't know how to be the kind of mother a Shelton child needs. Maybe I'm just fooling myself thinking I can—" "Stop." The command in Tommy's voice was gentle but firm. "You painted love into that room. Any child would be lucky to grow up surrounded by that kind of care." "Ben didn't even defend it," she whispered. "When she called it childish and inappropriate, he just agreed. Said maybe it was time to think more seriously about the baby's development." Tommy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you want for your child?" The question caught her off guard. In months of pregnancy, through countless discussions about nursery furniture and nanny candidates and trust funds, no one had ever asked what she actually wanted for her baby. "I want them to feel loved," she said simply. "I want them to know they're valued for who they are, not what they can become. I want them to see beauty in the world, to believe in magic and possibility and—" She trailed off, realizing how naive she sounded. "That's not naive," Tommy said, as if reading her thoughts. "That's exactly what every child deserves." Something in his voice made her look up sharply. There was pain there, carefully hidden but recognizable to someone who'd learned to mask her own suffering. "Tell me about Willow," she said impulsively. Tommy's expression softened. "She's everything good I'm not. Optimistic when she should be bitter. Kind when the world has been cruel to her. She still believes people are fundamentally good, despite everything she's seen in hospitals and treatment centers. She sounds wonderful." "She is." Tommy moved closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And she would tell you that. Any child lucky enough to have you as a mother has already won the most important lottery in the world." The sincerity in his voice broke something open in Althea's chest. When had Ben last looked at her the way Tommy was looking at her now? When had her husband last seen value in her kindness, her creativity, her capacity for love? "Would you—" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Would you help me save one mural before they paint over everything?" Tommy's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. What did you have in mind? For the next hour, they worked together to carefully preserve a small section of wall behind the bookshelf, a hidden mural of a garden where painted butterflies danced among flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light. As they painted, their hands occasionally brushed, sending sparks of awareness through Althea that she tried desperately to ignore. The work felt like rebellion and resurrection combined. Each brushstroke was a quiet act of defiance against the sterile perfection. Juniper demanded, a promise to their child that somewhere in this cold house beauty and love still existed. Tommy proved surprisingly skilled with a paintbrush, his large hands capable of incredibly delicate detail work. "You're good at this," Althea observed, watching him add tiny highlights to a butterfly's wings. "Willow taught me," he admitted. "During her first round of chemo, she was too weak to hold a brush for very long, so I became her hands. She'd describe what she wanted to paint, and I'd try to capture it." The image of Tommy patiently learning to paint so he could help his sick sister create art was almost too beautiful to bear. Althea felt her heart crack open a little more, making room for feelings she'd been trying to deny. "This is our secret," she whispered, as they added the final touches to their hidden masterpiece. "Our secret," Tommy agreed, and the way he said, "ah," made her heart skip dangerously. They were cleaning their brushes when Ben returned home early, his footsteps sharp in the hallway. Tommy immediately stepped back, but not before Ben appeared in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. With laser focus. "What's this?" Ben's voice was deceptively calm. "Tommy was helping me save some art supplies," Althea said quickly, "before the nursery renovation." Ben's gaze moved between them, calculating and cold. He noted the paint on their hands, the comfortable way they stood together, the intimate concentration that had surrounded their shared work. How thoughtful, though I'm sure Tommy has more pressing security matters to attend to than arts and crafts. The dismissal was crystal clear, and Tommy left without another word, but as Ben helped Althea clean up the remaining paint, his grip on her wrist was just a little too tight, his smile just a little too sharp. "Mother is very pleased with the renovation plans," he said conversationally. "She thinks a more sophisticated environment will be much better for our son's development." "What if it's a daughter?" Althea asked before she could stop herself. Ben's laugh held no warmth whatsoever. "It won't be. Shelton men always have sons first. It's tradition." That night, as Ben made love to her with the methodical precision he brought to all his acquisitions, Althea stared at the ceiling and thought about hidden murals and gentle hands and the difference between being possessed and being cherished. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing her inner turmoil, and she found herself hoping that somehow, someday, her child would know what it felt like to be loved without conditions. In the darkness, she could almost feel Tommy's presence, somewhere in the building, standing guard over her dreams, even as everything else crumbled around her. And in that small comfort, she found the strength to believe that love, real, unconditional, transformative love, still existed in the world, even if she had to hide it behind bookshelves and secret painted gardens. Chapter 4. Storms Gathering. The most dangerous storms are those that build in silence before unleashing their fury. The morning sun cast long shadows across the penthouse as Althea discovered the full extent of Juniper's renovation. The nursery had been transformed overnight into something that resembled a sterile medical facility more than a room designed for a child. Gone were the warm yellows and playful murals, replaced by clinical whites and greys that made the space feel cold and unwelcoming. But it wasn't just the nursery. Ben had taken his mother's advice to heart, systematically removing every trace of warmth Althea had tried to bring to their home. The colourful throw pillows she'd chosen for the living room had been replaced with austere beige ones. Her small collection of plants, vibrant African violets and cheerful sunflowers that had reminded her of her grandmother's apartment, had been donated to charity while she slept. "I thought you'd appreciate the cleaner aesthetic," Ben said, casually over breakfast, not bothering to look up from his financial reports. Mother was right. We were letting things get a bit too cluttered. Althea stared at the sterile perfection surrounding her, feeling like a guest in her own home. "You threw away my plants." "Donated," Ben corrected. "And they were becoming a maintenance issue. The housekeeper complained about the watering schedule. And honestly, Althea, they were looking rather sad lately. Everything dies eventually. Better to clear space for things that matter." The casual cruelty of his words hit her like a physical blow. Those plants had been her last connection to the woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her that beauty could bloom anywhere if tended with love. Her grandmother had kept plants in coffee cans and mason jars, creating gardens on fire escapes and window sills that transformed their tiny apartment into something magical. Each missing plant felt like a small death, another piece of her past erased to satisfy Ben's vision of perfection. "They mattered to me," she whispered. Ben finally looked up, his expression mildly irritated. "You're being emotional. Pregnancy hormones, I suppose. Perhaps you should speak to Dr. Hayes about managing them better." The suggestion that her grief was merely a chemical imbalance to be managed rather than a legitimate response to loss made Althea's throat tighten with rage and despair. She excused herself before the tears could start, seeking refuge in the only space that still felt like hers, the small art studio Ben grudgingly allowed her to maintain. But even there, the changes were evident. Her oil paints had been replaced with less toxic watercolors. Her collection of brushes, some inherited from her grandmother, had been culled to a basic set more appropriate for a beginner. The large canvas she'd been working on, a vibrant piece full of movement and color, had been replaced with a small pre-stretched canvas suitable for simple studies. Tommy found her there an hour later, sitting in stunned silence amid the ruins of her creative life. "I brought you some tea," he said softly, setting a steaming cup beside her easel. "Chamomile with honey, the way you like it." The simple kindness broke through her numbness like sunlight through storm clouds. "They're trying to erase me," she said quietly, "piece by piece, until there's nothing left but what they want me to be." Tommy's expression grew tense, and for a moment she saw a flash of something dangerous in his normally calm demeanor. "This isn't right. It's my life." The words came out flat, defeated. "This is what I signed up for when I married Ben." "No." Tommy's voice was firm. "You signed up to be a wife, not a prisoner. You signed up to share a life, not disappear into someone else's vision of perfection." Althea looked up at him, surprised by the passion in his voice. In the 6 months he'd worked for them, she'd never heard him speak with such intensity about anything personal. "You don't understand," she said. "I have nowhere else to go. No money of my own, no family left, no career. I gave up everything for this marriage. You still have your art. They can change your supplies, but they can't change what's inside you." Tommy moved closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Don't let them make you smaller, Althea. The world needs what you create." The intimacy in his voice sent heat coursing through her veins. Ben spoke her name like he was checking an item off a list, but when Tommy said it, it sounded like a prayer. "I used to paint murals," she found herself saying, "in community centers and schools in Harlem. Children would stop and watch, and their faces would light up when they saw the characters coming to life on the walls. I felt like I was giving them something beautiful in a world that didn't always show them beauty." "You can do that again," Tommy said. "Maybe not the same way, but there are other ways to bring beauty into the world." "With what?" "Beginners. Watercolors and a canvas the size of a placemat? Tommy was quiet for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. "My grandmother left this to me," he said, opening it to reveal a set of professional-grade colored pencils, their tips sharp and ready. She was an artist too. Not famous or anything, but she could make anything beautiful with these. Althea stared at the pencils, recognizing the expensive brand, the careful way they'd been maintained. "Tommy, I can't." "Yes, you can." He placed the box in her hands, his fingers warm against hers. She would have wanted them to be used by someone who understands what art means, someone who knows that creating beauty is a form of resistance against ugliness. The weight of the gift, both physical and emotional, nearly overwhelmed her. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Tommy's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something in them that made her breath catch. "Because everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not who others want them to be." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and dangerous possibilities. Then footsteps in the hallway broke the spell, and Tommy stepped back just as Ben appeared in the doorway. "There you are," Ben said, his gaze sharp as it moved between them. "I've been looking for you. We have the Pemberton dinner tonight, remember?" Althea quickly closed the box of pencils, her heart hammering. "Of course, I'll go get ready." As she moved to leave, Ben's hand shot out to grasp her wrist. "What's that?" "Art supplies," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "I thought we discussed this. The doctor said you shouldn't be exposed to art materials in your condition." "They're just colored pencils," Tommy interjected quietly. "Non-toxic, perfectly safe for pregnant women." Ben's eyes narrowed as he focused on Tommy. "And you would know this how?" "My sister is an art student," Tommy replied evenly. "I've learned a lot about art safety over the years." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Althea almost believed it herself. But she could see the calculation in Ben's eyes, the way he was cataloguing this interaction for future reference. "How interesting," Ben said slowly. "Perhaps you could focus more on security and less on art education. I'd hate for your attention to be divided." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Tommy inclined his head in acknowledgement, but Althea caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd received the message loud and clear. That evening, at the Pemberton dinner, Althea played her role flawlessly. The devoted wife, the glowing mother-to-be, the perfect accessory to Ben's success. She smiled at the right moments, laughed at the appropriate jokes, and deflected personal questions with practiced ease. But all night, her fingers itched to hold those colored pencils, to create something beautiful in defiance of the sterile perfection that was slowly suffocating her soul. When they returned home, Ben dismissed Tommy with unusual curtness, sending him away earlier than normal. As they prepared for bed, Ben's hands were possessive as he undressed her, his touch claiming rather than caressing. "You've been different lately," he murmured against her neck as he pulled her into bed. "Distant. I don't like it." "I'm just tired," Althea replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. "The pregnancy is getting more difficult." Ben's hand settled on her swollen belly, but his touch felt cold rather than loving. "Well, soon enough we'll have our son and things can go back to normal. You'll have less time for distractions." As Ben fell asleep beside her, Althea lay awake thinking about Tommy's grandmother's pencils hidden in her art supplies, about the difference between being touched and being treasured, about the way some storms built slowly before they changed everything in their path. Outside their window, she could see the lights of the city stretching endlessly in all directions, each one representing a life, a dream, a possibility. Somewhere out there, Tommy was probably checking on his sister, or reading, or simply existing in a world where kindness didn't have to be hidden and art wasn't seen as a threat to order. The baby moved restlessly inside her, and she placed her hand over the spot, whispering silent promises about love and beauty and the courage to fight for both, even when the whole world seemed determined to take them away. Chapter 5. The Night of Storms. Sometimes the most violent storms are the ones that finally clear the air. The evening began with deceptive calm. Ben returned from a particularly successful business deal worth millions, his mood seemingly jovial. He brought Althea expensive jewelry, a diamond necklace that cost more than most people's homes, but presented it with the casual indifference of someone buying groceries. "For carrying my son," he said, assuming the baby's gender with typical arrogance. The weight of the diamonds felt cold against her throat as he fastened the clasp, his fingers impersonal as a jeweler appraising merchandise. Althea tried to express gratitude, but something in her voice, perhaps a lack of sufficient amazement, at his generosity or the way she unconsciously touched her belly when he mentioned his son, triggered his darker nature. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his smile became more precise, the subtle shift in his posture that preceded his most calculated cruelties. The argument escalated over dinner when Althea mentioned feeling dizzy during the day and wanting to see her doctor sooner than scheduled. The admission slipped out before she could stop it, born from genuine concern for her baby's well-being. Ben's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and she watched the calculation begin behind his cold eyes. Ben interpreted this as criticism of his care, questioning why she needed so much medical attention when women throughout history gave birth without all this fuss. Brie, his voice took on the patronizing tone he used when explaining basic business concepts to people he considered intellectually inferior. When Althea gently suggested that prenatal care was important for both her and the baby's health, Ben's facade of civility crumbled like expensive wallpaper, peeling away to reveal the rot beneath. "You think you know better than me?" he snarled, his voice turning ice cold. "Everything you have, everything you are, exists because I allow it. That designer maternity dress, this penthouse, the food you eat, all mine. You seem to have forgotten that without me you'd still be painting murals in some Harlem community center for pocket change." Althea's pregnancy hormones and months of suppressed frustration finally overwhelmed her usual careful diplomacy. "At least in Harlem, people treated me like a human being instead of a prized possession," she responded, her voice shaking but defiant. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Ben's reaction was swift and calculated. He grabbed her arm, not hard enough to leave visible marks, but firmly enough to remind her of his physical power. "You want to be treated like you were in Harlem," he hissed. "Fine. Let me remind you what life was like before I rescued you from that world." Outside, a fierce thunderstorm raged across Manhattan, turning the city into a landscape of rain and lightning. Ben drags a heavily pregnant Althea toward the door, his grip iron-strong on her wrist. Tommy appears immediately, his training alerting him to the dangerous shift in Ben's demeanor. "Sir, the weather is severe. Perhaps—" Tommy begins, but Ben cuts him off with vicious pleasure. "The help doesn't speak unless spoken to," Ben snarls. "In fact, since my wife thinks she was better off in her old life, she can experience it again. Maybe standing in the rain will remind her how good she has it here." Ben forces Althea outside onto the penthouse's wraparound terrace, where the storm hits her like a physical assault. 8 months pregnant, she's immediately soaked through her silk dress, shivering violently as rain pounds down. The wind threatens to knock her over, and she clutches desperately at the terrace railing, her other hand protecting her belly. "This will teach you a lesson about gratitude," Ben shouts over the thunder, then retreats inside, locking the door behind him. Through the glass, Althea can see him calmly pouring himself brandy, occasionally glancing out at her suffering with cold satisfaction. 20 minutes pass like hours. Althea's lips turn blue with cold, and she begins to feel lightheaded, her body unable to maintain its core temperature. The baby's movements become erratic, and she feels alarming cramping in her lower back, stress contractions that make her terrified for the baby's safety. "I'm sorry," she sobs into the storm. "I'm so sorry I brought you into this. You deserve so much better than this, little one. You deserve love and warmth and safety, and I don't know how to give you any of those things." Through the rain and her own tears, she can see Ben in the living room, calmly reading financial reports as if nothing is happening. The casual indifference to her suffering, to their child's welfare, is more devastating than any physical blow he could have delivered. Then, cutting through the storm like salvation itself, headlights appear in the circular drive below. A car door slams, and Althea hears the sound of running footsteps. Hope flares in her chest, desperate and bright. "Please," she whispers to whatever force has sent help, "please let it be." The elevator chimes, and through the rain-blurred glass, she sees Tommy burst into the penthouse. His hair is wet from the storm, his shirt disheveled, and his eyes are wild with something she's never seen before, protective fury that burns like wildfire. "Where is she?" Tommy's voice carries clearly through the glass, and Althea sees Ben look up from his reports. With mild annoyance. "She's learning a lesson about gratitude," Ben replies calmly. "Something you might benefit from as well." Tommy's gaze finds the terrace doors, and when he sees Althea collapsed against the glass, soaked and shivering, his expression transforms into something that makes Ben actually step backward. "You left a pregnant woman outside in a storm." Tommy's voice is deadly quiet. "You left your wife, your 8 months pregnant wife, outside to suffer while you sat inside reading?" "I don't answer to the help," Ben snaps, but there's uncertainty in his voice now. Tommy moves toward the terrace doors with purpose, and Ben steps into his path. "Stand down," Ben orders. "That's my wife, and I'll handle her as I see fit." "Get out of my way!" Tommy's voice carries the kind of authority that makes grown men step aside, and something in his tone penetrates Ben's arrogance. "You forget yourself," Ben says, but he moves aside as Tommy unlocks the terrace doors. The moment the doors open, Tommy is there, wrapping his coat around Althea's trembling form and lifting her into his arms as if she weighs nothing. His warmth is shocking after the brutal cold, and she finds herself clinging to him like a lifeline. "I've got you," Tommy whispers against her hair. "You're safe now. I'm here." As he carries her inside, Tommy's eyes meet Ben's with undisguised contempt. When he speaks, his voice is low and controlled, but every word rings with absolute conviction. A real man protects the woman carrying his child. He doesn't use her vulnerability as a weapon to prove his power. He doesn't stand by while she suffers, and he sure as hell doesn't create her suffering for his own entertainment. Ben's face flushes with rage. "How dare you—" "I dare because someone needs to," Tommy interrupts, his arms tightening protectively around Althea. "Someone needs to remind you that being wealthy doesn't make you a man, and having power doesn't give you the right to abuse it." The two men stare at each other across the pristine living room, and Althea realizes that something fundamental has shifted. Tommy is no longer just the hired help. In this moment, he's her protector, her champion, the man who has risked everything to keep her safe. "You're fired," Ben says coldly. "Good," Tommy replies without hesitation. "I quit." As Tommy carries her toward the guest bedroom, Althea looks back to see Ben standing alone in his perfect living room, surrounded by his expensive possessions and his cold control, while outside the storm rages on, washing the city. clean for whatever is to come. Chapter 6. Healing Touch. Sometimes healing requires more than medicine. It requires the touch of someone who truly cares. Steam rose from the bathroom like incense in a temple as Tommy carefully adjusted the water temperature, testing it with his wrist, the way his grandmother had taught him when he was barely old enough to bathe himself. The memory of her patient instruction felt like a blessing now. One more way, the woman who'd raised him continued to guide his hands toward gentleness in a world that often demanded hardness. Althea sat on the edge of the tub, wrapped in his coat and still shivering. Despite being inside, her lips blue and her skin pale as moonlight. The contrast was stark. Her dark skin drained of its usual warm glow, her normally bright eyes dulled with shock and cold. Even her hair, usually so full of life and curl, hung limp and soaked against her skull like seaweed washed up by a cruel tide. "Not too hot," Tommy murmured, more to himself than to her, his voice thick with an emotion he was struggling to contain. "Your body needs to warm gradually, or it could shock your system." His military medical training had kicked in the moment he'd seen her collapsed on the terrace, but beneath the clinical knowledge ran a current of rage so pure and protective, it threatened to overwhelm his careful control. Ben had left her there, had actually walked away from his pregnant wife while she suffered in a dangerous storm, as if her pain was merely an inconvenience to be ignored while he attended to more important matters. The image of Ben calmly sipping brandy, while Althea, nearly collapsed from hypothermia, would be burned into Tommy's memory forever, a stark reminder of the difference between a man who possessed and a man who cherished. "I can't stop shaking," Althea whispered, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely form the words. "That's your body trying to generate heat," Tommy explained gently, helping her stand on unsteady legs. "It's actually a good sign. It means your core temperature hasn't dropped too dangerously low." He paused, his hands respectfully steady on her arms. "I need to help you out of these wet clothes, or you'll never warm up. Is that okay?" The question was asked with such careful respect that Althea felt tears sting her eyes. When had Ben last asked her permission for anything involving her own body? When had he last treated her autonomy as something worthy of consideration? "Yes," she managed, and Tommy's touch was clinical, yet infinitely gentle as he helped her out of the sodden silk dress that clung to her skin like a punishment. He averted his eyes when possible, his movements professional and efficient, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, fury at what Ben had done, carefully contained, but burning bright. The warm bathwater felt like salvation against her frozen skin. Althea sank into it slowly, following Tommy's quiet instructions, and gradually feeling began to return to her numb extremities. It was a strange intimacy, being cared for so tenderly by someone who asked nothing in return. The warmth seeped into her bones like hope itself, and she felt the baby, who had been moving frantically during her ordeal, responding to her stress and fear, begin to settle as her body temperature slowly normalized. Tommy sat on the floor beside the tub, fully clothed and watchful, his back straight with military posture, but his eyes soft with concern. He monitored her breathing, the return of color to her cheeks, the way her shivering gradually subsided. His presence was both professional and deeply personal, ready to call emergency services if her condition worsened, but also simply there, because he couldn't bear to leave her alone after what she'd endured. "The cramping is stopping," Althea whispered after a while, one hand pressed to her belly where stress contractions had been threatening the baby's safety. I think we're both okay." "Thank God," Tommy breathed, his shoulders sagging with relief she hadn't realized he was carrying. For a moment, his careful composure cracked, and she saw the fear he'd been hiding, not just for her, but For the child who had become precious to him, despite having no biological claim to love. "Better?" he asked after a while, and she nodded, surprised to find that she actually was better. "How did you know to come back?" she asked. "You'd already left for the night." Tommy's jaw tightened. "I was halfway home when the storm hit, and something felt wrong. Call it instinct or experience or just—" He paused, searching for words. "I couldn't shake the feeling that you might need help." The simple admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. Tommy had risked his job, his sister's medical security, everything that mattered to him, because of a feeling that she might be in danger. "You lost your job because of me," Althea said quietly. "Willow's treatments—" "Don't." Tommy's voice was firm but gentle. "Don't you dare apologize for what he did, and don't worry about Willow. I'll figure something out." But Althea could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of responsibility he carried for his sister's survival. By protecting her, Tommy had sacrificed his family's security, and the knowledge of that sacrifice made her chest tight with gratitude and guilt. "Stay with me tonight," she said impulsively, then flushed at how the words sounded. "I mean, I don't want to be alone with him. Not tonight." Tommy's expression softened. "Of course. I'll be right outside the door." "No!" Althea's voice was stronger now, warmed by more than just the bathwater. "In here, please. I need to know someone is watching over me, who actually cares whether I live or die." The naked honesty of her words seemed to break something open in Tommy's chest. For a moment, his carefully maintained professional distance wavered, and she saw the man beneath the bodyguard, someone who had been watching her suffer for months, powerless to intervene until tonight. "Althea," he said quietly, her name on his lips like a prayer, like something precious that deserved to be spoken with reverence. "You know I care. More than I should, more than is smart, more than is safe for either of us." The confession settled between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. In the soft light of the bathroom, with steam rising around them like a protective veil, they both understood what he was admitting. The carefully maintained boundaries that had kept them both safe from the dangerous pull between them were dissolving like sugar in rain, and neither of them had the strength to rebuild them. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with exhaustion and honesty and something that felt dangerously like hope. "I care too, more than I should, more than I ever thought I could again. Them." The admission hung in the warm air between them, heavy with implications and possibilities, and the terrifying beauty of truth finally spoken aloud. Tommy's hand moved involuntarily toward her face, then stopped, trembling with the effort of restraint. The space between them felt electric, charged with months of suppressed longing and the stark realization that they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. As the water began to cool, Tommy helped her from the tub with the same gentle efficiency, wrapping her in warm towels that he'd heated on the radiator. His touch was reverent, protective, completely different from Ben's possessive handling of her body. "You need to get some rest," Tommy said, but he made no move to leave as Althea settled into the guest room bed, finally warm and dry. "Will you stay just until I fall asleep?" Tommy nodded, settling into the chair beside the bed like a guardian angel in civilian clothes. In the soft lamplight, Althea studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the gentle strength in his hands as they rested on the chair arms. "Tommy?" Her voice was drowsy now, exhaustion finally, claiming her after the trauma of the evening. "Yes? Thank you for coming back, for protecting me, for—" She paused, searching for words adequate to express what his care meant to her. for seeing me as worth saving." Tommy's eyes met hers in the dim light, and for a moment the careful walls between them dissolved completely. "You're worth everything," he said simply, and the quiet conviction in his voice made her believe, for the first time in years, that maybe she actually was. As sleep finally claimed her, Althea felt safer than she had in months. Outside the guest room, she could hear Ben moving around the penthouse, probably drinking and brooding about the evening's confrontation. But none of that mattered now, because between her and the rest of the world sat a man who had proven that he would risk everything to keep her safe. The baby settled peacefully inside her, as if sensing the shift in their circumstances, and Althea drifted off to the sound of Tommy's steady breathing, the quiet presence of someone who watched over her, not because he was paid to, but because she mattered to him. In the morning, everything would be different. Ben's fury would be cold and calculated. The consequences of Tommy's defiance would become clear, and difficult decisions would have to be made. But for now, wrapped in warmth and protected by genuine care, Althea slept peacefully for the first time in her marriage. And in his chair beside her bed, Tommy kept watch through the night, his eyes alert for any sign of danger, his heart full of a love he was finally beginning to admit to himself, even if he couldn't yet speak it aloud. Chapter 7. New Life, New Love. Sometimes life enters the world exactly when hope seems lost, bringing light to the darkest moments. The contractions began at dawn, gentle at first, so subtle that Althea initially mistook them for the lingering effects of the previous night's trauma. She lay in the guest room bed, watching pale morning light filter through silk curtains, and tried to convince herself that the tightening sensation across her belly was merely stress, exhaustion, anything but what her instincts told her it actually was. Tommy had remained vigilant throughout the night, dozing fitfully in the chair beside her bed. His presence had been a constant comfort, a gentle barrier between her and the cold reality of her marriage. Now, as consciousness fully returned, she found him already awake, his hazel eyes alert and concerned as he studied her face. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly, his voice still rough with sleep. "Different," Althea admitted, then gasped as another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, impossible to ignore. "Tommy, I think—" "The baby," he finished, instantly alert. "How far apart are they?" As if summoned by their conversation, another wave of tightening pain rolled across her abdomen, and Althea gripped the bedsheets with white-knuckled intensity. "I don't know. Maybe 10 minutes. Tommy, it's too early. I'm only 8 months." "Stress can trigger early labor," Tommy said, his voice steady despite the worry in his eyes. "And last night was about as stressful as it gets." He was already reaching for his phone. "I'm calling Dr. Hayes." But before he could dial, Ben's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "What's all this noise?" Ben stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his expression coldly irritated. He'd clearly spent the night in his study, probably drinking and plotting revenge for Tommy's insubordination. "Some of us have important meetings this morning." "Althea's in labor," Tommy said without looking up from his phone. Ben's expression shifted from irritation to calculation. "Labor? But she's not due for another month." "Premature labor brought on by extreme stress," Tommy replied, his tone clinical but loaded with accusation, "also known as what happens when you leave a pregnant woman outside in a storm." The two men stared at each other across the room, and Althea felt another contraction building, stronger than the last. She doubled over with a cry of pain, and immediately Tommy was beside her, his hand gentle on her back. "Breathe," he murmured. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it." Ben watched this display of care with narrowed eyes. I suppose you think you're some kind of medical expert now? Combat medic training, Tommy replied shortly. I've delivered babies in worse conditions than this. Another contraction hit, and this time Althea couldn't contain her cry of pain. The baby was coming, ready or not, and she felt a spike of terror at the thought of bringing her child into the cold reality of her marriage. We need to get to the hospital, Tommy said, but Ben stepped forward with authority. I'll handle this. You've done quite enough already. Ben pulled out his own phone. I'll call my driver. Where's your driver going to take her? Tommy challenged. You fired me, remember? I'm not your employee anymore, which means I don't take orders from you. The standoff might have continued indefinitely if Althea hadn't been seized by another contraction. This one so intense it left her gasping and trembling. Both men immediately focused on her, their conflict temporarily forgotten in the face of her obvious distress. Please, she whispered. Just get me to the hospital. I don't care who drives. In the end, it was Tommy who helped her to the car. Tommy who timed her contractions during the frantic drive through morning traffic. Tommy who held her hand while Ben made phone calls from the front seat, already spinning the story for whatever business associates might be inconvenienced by this development. At Mount Sinai, Dr. Hayes was waiting with a wheelchair and a team of nurses who immediately swept Althea into the controlled chaos of labor and delivery. The next several hours passed in a blur of medical efficiency, pain that came in waves like an ocean tide, and the surreal sense that her life was changing irrevocably with each passing moment. Ben paced the delivery room like a caged predator, fielding phone calls and checking his watch as if his child's birth was merely another item on his busy schedule. But Tommy remained constantly at Althea's side, his presence steady and reassuring, even as her world narrowed to the primal rhythm of bringing new life into the world. The labor was complicated by the baby's premature status. Dr. Hayes monitored everything closely, her experienced hands guiding Althea through each contraction, while a neonatal team stood ready in case the baby needed immediate intervention. The uncertainty was terrifying. At 32 weeks, the baby's lungs might not be fully developed, requiring weeks in the NICU. Each contraction brought a mixture of anticipation and fear, the knowledge that they were racing against time to bring this child safely into the world. Between contractions, Althea could hear the stark contrast in the room's atmosphere. Ben paced near the window, his phone constantly buzzing with what he deemed more pressing matters than his child's birth. Yes, I understand the Tokyo markets are opening, he said in a hushed but irritated tone. But surely Henderson can handle the preliminary negotiations without me micromanaging every detail. Meanwhile, Tommy remained a constant calming presence at her bedside. During the worst contractions, when pain threatened to overwhelm her completely, he would lean close and whisper encouragement. You're bringing life into the world, he murmured during one particularly intense moment. There's nothing more powerful than what you're doing right now. His words anchored her when the pain made her feel like she was drowning, reminding her that this agony had purpose, that every surge of pain brought their child closer to safety. You're doing beautifully, Tommy murmured during a brief respite between contractions. So strong, so brave. I'm scared, Althea confessed, gripping his hand with desperate intensity. What if something's wrong? What if the baby isn't okay because of last night? Hey. Tommy's voice was infinitely gentle. Look at me. The monitors all look good. Dr. Hayes says everything is progressing normally for a premature birth. This baby is going to be fine. Ben chose that moment to snap his phone shut with visible frustration. The Pemberton deal is falling apart because I can't be in the office today. This is incredibly inconvenient timing. The casual selfishness of the comment hit Althea like a physical blow. Their child was fighting to enter the world, and Ben's primary concern was a business deal. Maybe you should go, she said quietly. Handle your deal. Tommy can stay with me. Ben's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Tommy doesn't belong here. He's not family. Neither are you, apparently, Althea shot back, another contraction stealing her breath and her diplomacy. When did you last ask how I'm feeling? When did you last care about anything other than how this affects your schedule? The accusation hung in the sterile air like a challenge, and for a moment Ben looked genuinely shocked. But before he could respond, Dr. Hayes bustled back into the room with the controlled urgency that meant business was about to get serious. Okay, Althea, we're getting close. I can see the baby's head. Are you ready to meet your child? The next 20 minutes were the most intense of Althea's life. Pain and effort and fear all blended together into a primal experience that stripped away every pretense, every social nicety, every carefully maintained facade. There was only the work of bringing her child safely into the world, and Tommy's steady presence anchoring her to strength she didn't know she possessed. Push, Althea. That's it. Perfect. One more big push. And then, suddenly, the pain crested and broke like a wave, and the most beautiful sound in the world filled the delivery room. A baby's first indignant cry, healthy and strong and absolutely furious about being evicted from the warm darkness of the womb. The sound pierced through every other noise in the room, cutting through Ben's phone conversation and the medical equipment's beeping to announce that a new soul had entered the world. "It's a girl," Dr. Hayes announced, lifting a tiny, precious person into the bright lights of the delivery room. A beautiful, healthy daughter. Despite arriving 5 weeks early, the baby was clearly a fighter. Her cry was remarkably strong for a premature infant, her tiny fists waving with determination that spoke of an indomitable spirit. The neonatal team quickly assessed her breathing and vital signs, their relief evident as they confirmed that while she would need monitoring, her lungs had developed enough to avoid immediate intubation. She was small, barely 5 pounds, but flawless in every way that mattered. Althea burst into tears at the sight of her child, red-faced and wrinkled and absolutely beautiful, with a shock of dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions and tiny fingers that grasped at the air, as if already reaching for love. This was her daughter, the life she had carried and protected through months of emotional turmoil, and the overwhelming rush of maternal love was so intense it felt like being reborn herself. "A daughter," she whispered, love flooding her heart. So completely it felt like drowning in joy. Ben's face was a study in disappointment. A girl, but the ultrasounds suggested. The ultrasounds were unclear, Dr. Hayes said diplomatically. "Congratulations, you have a beautiful daughter." But Althea barely heard the exchange. Her entire world had narrowed to the tiny person, being placed on her chest for brief skin-to-skin contact before the neonatal team would need to take her for monitoring. This was her daughter, her child, the life she'd protected and nurtured for 8 months despite everything. "Hello, beautiful," she whispered, and the baby's cries immediately quieted, as if recognizing her mother's voice. "I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you're safe." Tommy stood beside the bed, tears unashamedly streaming down his cheeks as he watched mother and daughter meet for the first time. "She's perfect," he said softly. "Absolutely perfect. The baby will need to go to the NICU for monitoring," Dr. Hayes explained gently. "Premature babies need extra support for their breathing and feeding, but she's responding very well. You should be able to hold her again in a few hours." The separation was heartbreaking but necessary. Althea watched as the neonatal team carefully transferred her daughter to a specialized incubator, her tiny body dwarfed by medical equipment, but her spirit clearly fierce and determined. "Would you like to walk with her to the NICU?" A nurse asked Tommy, mistaking him for the father given his obvious emotional investment. Tommy looked to Althea, who nodded through her tears. "Go with her," Althea whispered. "Don't let her be alone." As Tommy followed their daughter down the hallway, his large frame protective even in the sterile hospital environment, Althea felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of family. Ben stood awkwardly to one side, clearly unsure how to process having a daughter instead of the son he'd assumed was his due. "Serenity," Althea said suddenly. "What?" Ben looked confused. "Her name is Serenity. She brought peace into chaos. She survived when everything around her was falling apart. She deserves a name that reflects the calm she's brought to my world." Ben's expression soured. Serenity. That's hardly a traditional Shelton name. What about Margaret after my grandmother, or Juniper after my mother? "Serenity," Althea repeated, her voice stronger now despite her exhaustion. Serenity Gibson Shelton. The inclusion of her own family. Name was a small act of rebellion, but it felt monumentally important. This child would carry forward the legacy of strength and creativity that Althea's grandmother had instilled in her, not just the cold privilege of the Shelton dynasty. When Tommy returned from the NICU, his eyes were bright with wonder. "She's incredible," he reported, already trying to pull out her monitors. "The nurses say she's one of the most alert premature babies they've seen. Like her mother," he added softly, and the way he said it made Althea's heart skip dangerously. Over the next several days, as Serenity fought to grow stronger in the NICU, a new rhythm developed. Ben visited briefly each day, staying long, enough to fulfill his paternal obligations before returning to work. But Tommy was a constant presence, learning to help with feeding tubes and monitor readings, spending hours talking to Serenity through the incubator walls. "Babies need to hear voices," he explained when Althea found him reading a newspaper article to their sleeping daughter. "It helps their brain development." Watching him gentle their tiny daughter with such careful devotion, seeing the love that radiated from him for a child that wasn't even biologically his, Althea felt her heart crack open in ways she'd never imagined possible. This was what family looked like, not the cold transaction of Ben's conception of marriage, but this warm, devoted care that asked for nothing and gave everything. After 2 weeks in the NICU, Serenity was finally strong enough to come home. As Althea held her daughter for the first time without wires and monitors, feeling the perfect weight of new life in her arms, she looked up to find Tommy watching them with an expression of such pure love that it took her breath away. "Ready to start our new life, little one?" she whispered to Serenity, and though she was speaking to her daughter, her eyes were on Tommy, the man who had already become the most important part of their future, even if they hadn't yet found the courage to name what was growing between them. Outside the hospital window, winter was giving way to spring, and everything in the world felt possible. Chapter 8. Found Family. The most beautiful families are often the ones that form in the spaces between heartbreak and hope. At 6 weeks old, motherhood had taught Althea that love could multiply, infinitely without ever diminishing. Every morning she woke to Serenity's soft breathing against her chest, feeling more complete than she had in years, despite the bone-deep exhaustion that came with caring for a former NICU baby. Serenity had thrived beyond all expectations after coming home, her tiny lungs growing stronger daily, her alert dark eyes already tracking movement and light with curious intelligence. Ben had returned to his normal routine within days of Serenity's homecoming, treating his daughter's presence like a minor inconvenience that had disrupted his schedule rather than a life-changing miracle. He'd hired a night nurse, Mrs. Patterson, ostensibly to help Althea recover, but actually to minimize the impact of infant care on his own sleep. The older woman was efficient and kind, but Althea found herself reluctant to hand over too much responsibility for her daughter's care. Tommy, meanwhile, had become an unexpected constant in their lives. Despite Ben's furious dismissal, he returned each morning with quiet determination, claiming he needed to collect his personal belongings from the security office. The process seemed to require several hours daily and always coincided with Serenity's busiest periods when Althea most needed an extra pair of competent hands. "She's growing so fast," Tommy murmured on a particularly peaceful afternoon, watching Serenity sleep in the portable bassinet Althea had moved to the sunroom. "Look at those eyelashes. She's going to be heartbreaker." Althea smiled, adjusting the soft pink blanket that had been a gift from Tommy's sister Willow, hand-knitted during her recent hospital stay, and sent with a note about welcoming baby Serenity into the family of people who believe in beautiful things. "Gee. She likes you," Althea observed, noting how peacefully Serenity slept when Tommy was nearby. "She settles faster when you're here." "Babies are smart," Tommy replied. "They know who they can trust." The simple observation carried layers of meaning that neither of them was quite ready to fully explore. But Althea felt the truth of it in her bones. Serenity did seem calmer in Tommy's presence, as if sensing the same protective strength that had made Althea feel safe during the worst moments of her marriage. Ben chose that moment to stride into the sunroom, his phone pressed to his ear and his expression tight with business frustration. "No, Henderson, you're still missing the point. The merger documents need to be finalized before the end of the quarter, or we lose the tax advantages." He paused, noticing Tommy's presence with obvious irritation. "I thought I made it clear that your services were no longer required." "I'm collecting my things," Tommy replied evenly, but Althea noticed he didn't move away from Serenity's bassinet. "It's taking you a remarkably long time to pack a few personal items," Ben observed coldly. "I want him here," Althea interjected, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Serenity is more settled when Tommy's around, and I need all the help I can get right now." Ben's eyes narrowed as he studied the domestic scene, his wife and former employee bonding over his daughter's care, creating an intimacy that excluded him entirely. "I've hired Mrs. Patterson for help," Ben reminded her. "Professional help. We don't need charity from the unemployed." The casual cruelty of the remark made Althea's temper flare. "Tommy isn't charity. He's—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't provoke Ben's jealousy while still honoring the truth of what Tommy meant to her. "He's been incredibly helpful, and Serenity responds well to him." "Serenity is 6 weeks old," Ben replied with the tone he used to explain basic concepts to incompetent employees. "She responds to anyone who feeds her or changes her diaper. She's not forming meaningful relationships yet." But even as he spoke, Serenity stirred in her bassinet, making the soft mewling sounds that preceded full-scale crying. Tommy immediately moved closer, his voice dropping to the gentle murmur that somehow always worked magic. "Hey there, beautiful girl. What's wrong? Are you just checking to make sure everyone's still here?" Miraculously, Serenity settled back into peaceful sleep at the sound of his voice, her tiny fist uncurling as if releasing whatever had troubled her dreams. Ben watched this interaction with the expression Althea couldn't quite read. "She's probably hungry," he said finally. "Babies cry when they're hungry." "She was fed an hour ago," Althea replied quietly. "She just likes to know Tommy's nearby." The admission hung in the sunroom's warm air like a challenge, and Althea realized she'd crossed some invisible line in acknowledging Tommy's importance in their lives. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it, not when she'd watched him spend the past 6 weeks providing the kind of gentle, consistent care that Ben seemed incapable of offering. "Well," Ben said after a long moment, his voice carefully controlled, "I suppose if it helps you recover faster, I can tolerate his presence for a little while longer. But this arrangement is temporary, Althea. Once you're back on your feet, we'll need to establish more appropriate boundaries." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Althea felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Ben was already planning to remove Tommy from their lives, to eliminate the one person who had shown genuine care for her and Serenity. That evening, after Ben had left for a business dinner and Mrs. Patterson had retired to her room, Althea found herself alone, with Tommy and Serenity in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. The baby was having one of her fussy periods, refusing to settle despite being fed, changed, and burped. Althea walked the living room in careful circles, bouncing gently and singing soft lullabies that seemed to have no effect. "Here," Tommy said quietly, extending his arms. "Let me try." Althea hesitated for only a moment before transferring Serenity to Tommy's capable hands. The change was immediate and almost magical. The baby's crying ceased, her tiny body relaxing into the security of his embrace. "How do you do that?" Althea asked, sinking onto the sofa with exhausted gratitude. "Practice," Tommy replied, settling beside her with Serenity cradled against his chest. "I helped raise Willow after our parents died. She was only 6 months old when I got out of the military, and she went through a phase where she'd only settle for me." The casual revelation hit Althea like a physical blow. "Tommy, I had no idea. You raised your sister?" "Someone had to." His smile was sad but determined. "Our grandmother helped, but she was already elderly. Willow needed stability, consistency. She needed to know that someone would always be there for her." Althea watched him gentle her daughter into peaceful sleep, this man who had sacrificed his youth to raise an orphaned baby, who now worked dangerous jobs to pay for his sister's medical care, who had risked everything to protect a woman and child who weren't even his family. "You're incredible," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Tommy's eyes met hers over Serenity's sleeping form, and for a moment, the careful boundaries they'd maintained dissolved completely. "So are you," he replied softly. "The way you love her, the way you protect her even when you're exhausted. Serenity is lucky to have you as her mother." "She's lucky to have you, too," Althea said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't fully contain. "I don't know what I would have done these past weeks without your help." "You would have figured it out," Tommy assured her. "But I'm glad I could be here. I'm glad I could help." They sat in comfortable silence as Serenity slept contentedly between them, creating a tableau of domestic contentment that felt more real than any of the expensive trappings surrounding them. This was what family felt like, Althea realized. Not the cold perfection Ben demanded, but this warm, supportive presence that asked for nothing and gave everything. "Tommy?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, when Ben fires you permanently, and we both know he will, what will you do? About Willow's treatments, I mean." Tommy's expression grew carefully neutral. "I'll figure something out. I always do." But Althea could see the worry he was trying to hide, the calculation of medical bills against diminishing savings, the terrible mathematics of love measured against financial reality. "There has to be something I can do," she said desperately. "Some way I can help." "You've done enough," Tommy replied firmly. "More than enough. You've let me be part of this, part of Serenity's first weeks. That's a gift I can never repay." As Serenity stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that preceded waking, Althea found herself making a decision that would change everything. "I want you to stay," she said quietly, Not just tonight, not just until Ben gets tired of fighting about it. I want you to be part of our lives, part of Serenity's life." Tommy's breath caught. "Althea, you don't understand what you're saying. The complications that would create, the danger." "I understand perfectly," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I understand that my daughter deserves to grow up knowing what real love looks like. I understand that I deserve better than a man who leaves me in storms and treats our child like an inconvenience. And I understand that sometimes the most important family isn't the one you're born into, but the one you choose." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible distance, and Althea realized she'd just declared war on everything Ben thought he controlled. But as she watched Tommy's expression transform from concern to hope to something that looked remarkably like love, she knew she'd finally found the courage to fight for what mattered. Outside the penthouse windows, the city sparkled with millions of lights, each one representing a life, a choice, a chance for happiness. And inside, 3 hearts beat in careful rhythm, creating a new definition of family that had nothing to do with law or money or obligation, and everything to do with the quiet miracle of choosing to love. Chapter 9. The Final Storm. The most dangerous predators are those who smile while they sharpen their claws. The morning arrived with deceptive peace, sunlight streaming through the penthouse windows like a blessing as Althea fed Serenity her breakfast bottle. At 8 weeks old, her daughter had developed a personality that was both determined and gentle. She knew what she wanted and made her needs known, but she also possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense the emotions of those around her, settling into calmness when others were calm, growing fussy when tension filled the air. Today, Serenity seemed unusually alert, her dark eyes tracking movement with the intense focus of someone much older than her few weeks of life. It was as if she sensed that something important was about to happen, though Althea couldn't have said what gave her that impression. Ben had been unusually pleasant all week, almost jovial in a way that set Althea's nerves on edge. He'd brought her flowers on Tuesday, expensive white roses that looked beautiful but had no scent, and had even complimented her recovery, noting that she'd bounced back remarkably well from childbirth. The praise felt wrong somehow, calculated rather than genuine, but Althea had accepted it with the careful grace that had become second nature during their marriage. Tommy arrived at his usual time, ostensibly to continue the increasingly elaborate process of collecting his personal belongings from the security office. Ben had stopped commenting on his presence, which should have been reassuring, but instead felt ominous, like the eye of a hurricane where everything seems calm before the destruction resumes. "Good morning, beautiful girls," Tommy said softly as he entered the sunroom where Althea was feeding Serenity. The baby immediately turned toward his voice, her entire face lighting up with what could only be described as joy. "She knows your voice," Althea observed, warmth flooding her chest as she watched her daughter's reaction to Tommy's presence. "Look how excited she gets when you arrive." Tommy settled into the chair beside them, his expression soft with affection as he watched Serenity enthusiastically attack her bottle. Smart girl, she knows who her people are. The casual possessiveness in his tone made Althea's heart skip. Over the past weeks, they'd grown into an easy domestic rhythm that felt more natural than anything she'd experienced with Ben. Tommy knew Serenity's schedule by heart, could read her moods with supernatural accuracy, and seemed to anticipate both mother and baby's needs with intuitive precision. "Tommy," Althea began, then paused as footsteps approached. But it wasn't Ben's confident stride. These were softer, more hesitant. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her usually composed expression troubled. "Mrs. Shelton, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with you privately." Something in the older woman's tone set off alarm bells in Althea's mind. Mrs. Patterson had been nothing but professional and kind during her employment, but now she looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. "Of course," Althea replied, transferring serenity to Tommy's waiting arms. "What is it?" Mrs. Patterson glanced nervously at Tommy, then back at Althea. "Perhaps we could speak in the nursery." The walk down the hallway felt endless, dread building in Althea's chest like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Mrs. Patterson closed the nursery door behind them and turned to face Althea with obvious reluctance. "I'm giving my notice," she said without preamble. "I'll be leaving at the end of the week." Althea blinked in surprise. "Has something happened? If there's a problem with your salary or duties—" "No, ma'am. Nothing like that." Mrs. Patterson twisted her hands together, clearly struggling with whatever she needed to say. "Mrs. Shelton, I need to tell you something, and I pray you'll forgive me for not speaking up sooner." The older woman's distress was palpable, and Althea felt ice beginning to form in her veins. "What is it?" "Your husband has been recording your conversations with Mr. Paul," Mrs. Patterson said in a rush, as if the words burned her tongue. "He installed listening devices throughout the penthouse while you were in the hospital. He's been documenting every interaction, every moment of closeness between you and that young man." The revelation hit Althea like a physical blow, leaving her gasping and lightheaded. "Recording us." "I saw him installing the equipment," Mrs. Patterson continued, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I should have warned you immediately, but he threatened my job, my references. My husband is ill, Mrs. Shelton, and we need my income for his medical care. But I can't stand by and watch what he's planning." "What's he planning?" Althea's voice came out as barely a whisper. Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled. "He's building a case for custody. He has recordings of you saying you want Mr. Paul to be part of Serenity's life. Conversations about choosing your family, moments where your feelings for each other have been obvious. He's going to use it all to prove you're an unfit mother." The room seemed to tilt sideways, and Althea had to grab the edge of the crib to keep from falling. Ben had been systematically documenting her growing feelings for Tommy, collecting evidence like a prosecutor, building a case for the death penalty. "He can't," she whispered. "He can't take Serenity away from me." "He's planning to divorce you for adultery and abandonment," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice thick with sympathy. "Even though nothing physical has happened between you and Mr. Paul, he has enough emotional evidence to paint a picture of unfaithfulness, and with his resources, his connections." Althea's mind raced through the implications. Ben's wealth could buy the best lawyers, could paint her as a mentally unstable woman who had abandoned her marriage for the hired help. In custody cases, mothers didn't automatically win, especially when facing a man with unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. "When?" Althea managed to ask. "Monday morning. I overheard him on the phone with his lawyer yesterday confirming the timeline. The papers are already prepared. He's arranged for private security to escort you from the building, and he's filed for emergency custody based on your alleged emotional instability following childbirth." 4 days. Althea had 4 days before Ben destroyed everything she'd fought to build, before he took Serenity away and relegated her to supervised visits with her own daughter. "Mrs. Patterson," Althea said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Thank you for telling me. I know what it cost you." The older woman nodded, wiping her tears. "That baby deserves better than to be used as a weapon, and you deserve the chance to protect yourself." As Mrs. Patterson left the nursery, Althea stood alone among the white walls and sterile perfection that Ben's mother had insisted upon, her mind racing through possibilities and obstacles. She had no money of her own, no resources beyond Ben's control, no legal standing to fight what was coming. But she had something Ben didn't understand. She had Tommy's unwavering loyalty, and she had a mother's desperate love for her child. When she returned to the sunroom, Tommy immediately sensed her distress. Serenity, feeding peacefully in his arms, seemed to pick up on the tension as well, her dark eyes growing alert and worried. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked quietly. Althea looked at him, holding her daughter. This man who had risked everything to protect them, who had given them both more love in 8 weeks than Ben had offered in 3 years of marriage. She thought about the recordings Ben had made, the evidence he'd collected of their growing feelings for each other, the trap he'd so carefully constructed. And she realized that sometimes love required the ultimate courage, the willingness to risk everything for the chance at real happiness. "Tommy," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to propose. "How do you feel about taking a very dangerous gamble on the future?" His eyes met hers across the sunroom, and she saw understanding dawn in their depths. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The war for Serenity's future was about to begin, and Althea finally understood that some battles were worth any cost, any sacrifice, any risk. Outside the penthouse windows, storm clouds were gathering again, but this time Althea wasn't afraid of the lightning. Chapter 10. Love conquers all. True love doesn't just endure the storm, it learns to dance in the rain. The revelation of Ben's surveillance should have felt like defeat, but as Althea sat in the sunroom with Tommy and Serenity, she experienced something unexpected: clarity. For the first time in her marriage, she understood exactly what she was fighting for and exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to get it. "We need to leave," she said quietly, watching Serenity sleep peacefully in Tommy's arms. "All of us, tonight." Tommy's expression grew carefully neutral. "Althea, if you run, Ben will use it against you in court. He'll claim you're unstable, that you've kidnapped his daughter." "He's going to claim that anyway," Althea interrupted. "Mrs. Patterson heard him talking to his lawyers. The custody papers are already prepared. By Monday morning, Serenity will be in his sole custody, and I'll be fighting for supervised visits with my own daughter." The weight of Ben's calculated cruelty settled between them like a toxic cloud. Tommy's jaw tightened as he processed the implications, his protective instincts warring with his understanding of legal realities. "There has to be another way," he said finally. "Some legal recourse. With what money? What lawyers? What evidence?" Althea's voice remained calm, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Ben controls everything. My bank accounts, my credit cards, even my medical records. He's been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The only advantage we have is that we know what's coming." Serenity stirred in Tommy's arms, making the soft, mewling sounds that meant she was waking up. As her dark eyes opened and focused on the adults above her, Althea felt a surge of fierce protectiveness that burned away any remaining doubt. "I won't let him use her as a weapon," she said firmly, "and I won't let him destroy what we've built together." Tommy's eyes met hers across their sleeping daughter, because that's what Serenity had become in all the ways that mattered, theirs. "Where would we go?" "I have an idea," Althea replied. "But first, there's something you need to know about me, something I've never told anyone, not even Ben." Tommy waited with the patience that had become one of his most endearing qualities, ready to listen, without judgment, whatever she needed to confess. "My grandmother didn't just raise me," Althea began. "She left me something when she died, a trust fund that Ben doesn't know about, set up by my grandfather before I was born. It's not enormous, but it's enough to disappear with if we're smart about it." Hope flickered in Tommy's expression, followed immediately by concern. "If Ben doesn't know about it, he doesn't know because I never told him," Althea admitted. "It was the one thing I kept for myself, the one piece of independence I couldn't bring myself to surrender. I've been sending the statements to a post office box, using an old friend's address for contact information." Tommy's smile was soft with understanding rather than judgment. "Smart woman." "My friend Sage still lives in Harlem," Althea continued. "She's an artist too, runs a small gallery and teaches art classes to kids. She's been telling me for years that I always have a place there if I need it. And your trust fund would be enough to start over, yes. To rent a small apartment, buy basic necessities, maybe even set up a little studio where I could paint again." Althea's voice grew stronger with each word. "It wouldn't be luxury, but it would be freedom." Tommy looked down at Serenity, who had begun making the happy gurgling sounds that meant she was fully awake and content. "What about Willow's medical bills? If I disappear with you, I lose any chance of finding another security job with references." Althea had been expecting this question, had been planning her answer since Mrs. Patterson's revelation. "The trust fund is bigger than I said," she admitted. "My grandfather was careful with investments. There's enough to cover Willow's treatments and our living expenses while we figure out the future." The offer hung between them, like a bridge spanning an impossible distance. Tommy could continue his current life, struggling to find work, fighting to pay for his sister's care, watching the woman he loved from a careful distance. Or he could take a leap of faith into an uncertain future with the people who had become his chosen family. "Ben will come after us," Tommy warned. "He has resources, connections. He won't just let this go." "I know." Althea's voice was steady, but her heart raced with the magnitude of what she was proposing. "But I'd rather fight him from a position of love than surrender from a position of fear." Tommy stood slowly, cradling Serenity against his chest as he walked to the window overlooking the city. For long minutes he was silent, weighing options and consequences with the precision that had kept him alive through military combat and dangerous security assignments. Althea watched his profile, seeing the war between hope and caution playing out in the set of his shoulders. She understood the magnitude of what she was asking. Tommy would be walking away from any chance of legitimate employment in security. He'd be risking prosecution for kidnapping charges if Ben chose to frame their departure that way. Most importantly, he'd be trusting her completely with his and Willow's future. Finally, he turned back to Althea, his expression resolved but grave. "What do you need me to do?" The next several hours passed in a blur of meticulous preparation and whispered conversations. While Ben attended his evening business dinner, they moved with the precision of a military operation. Tommy disabled the security cameras in strategic sequences, creating blind spots that would hide their movements. They gathered essential items in stages, Serenity's medical records and birth certificate first, then several weeks' worth of baby supplies, carefully transferred to gym bags that wouldn't arouse suspicion. Althea packed a single suitcase with practical clothes and the few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother. Her hands shook as she made each decision, what to take, what to leave behind forever. Every item felt weighted with the finality of this choice. The most heart-wrenching moment came when she removed the small section of hidden mural they'd created together. Rolling the canvas with trembling hands, she whispered a prayer that whatever else happened, their daughter would have this reminder of the love that had created their unconventional family. Tommy coordinated their escape route with military precision. He'd arranged for a rental car under his sister's name, parked 3 blocks away to avoid detection. He'd mapped a circuitous path out of the city that would confuse any tracking attempts. Most crucially, he'd contacted lawyers who specialized in protecting women fleeing dangerous situations, people who would be ready to help them establish legal residency in another state before Ben could mobilize his resources. As evening darkness settled over Manhattan, they sat together in the sunroom one last time, Serenity sleeping peacefully between them while her parents, in all the ways that truly mattered, made their final preparations to leave everything behind for love. "Are you scared?" Tommy asked softly. "Terrified," Althea admitted, "but not of leaving. I'm scared of what happens if we stay." Tommy reached across the space between them and took her hand, his fingers warm and steady against hers. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." "Together," Althea agreed, and the word felt like a promise, a prayer, and a declaration of war all at once. At midnight, they moved like ghosts through the penthouse's marble halls. Every sound seemed amplified, the soft whisper of Serenity's breathing, the barely audible squeak of the elevator doors, Tommy's controlled breathing as he carried their bags. In the lobby, the night security guard looked up from his magazine, and Althea's heart nearly stopped, but Tommy simply nodded and said, "Emergency call. Mrs. Shelton's mother took ill." The lie rolled off his tongue with convincing concern, and they were waved through without question. The night air hit them like freedom itself as they walked the 3 blocks to their waiting car. Serenity slept peacefully in her carrier, unaware that her life had just changed forever. Behind them, the lights of their former prison gleamed against the sky, beautiful and cold and finally permanently behind them. Serenity slept peacefully, in her car seat, unaware that her life had just changed forever, that she was traveling toward a future built on chosen love rather than inherited obligation. In the front seat, her parents held hands and watched the lights of Manhattan disappear behind them, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would meet them as a family. Ben would discover their absence in the morning, would rage and threaten and use every resource at his disposal to track them down. But by then, they would be in Sage's gallery in Harlem, beginning new lives as artists and lovers and the kind of parents who chose each other and their child over safety and convention. The love that had bloomed in stolen moments and secret gardens would finally have room to grow in the light.